Welcome to the Cartwright Murder by Merrick Sharp, narrated by Chris Michelson. Published by BrooksAudiobooks.com. All rights reserved. No portion of this audiobook may be reproduced in any form without written permission of the publisher. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks, and be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 1. This is the tale of how a middle-aged woman, once content in her solitude, lost her reason, abandoned her familiar life in the city, rented a summer cottage outside of town, and found herself entangled in one of those baffling crimes that keep newspapers and detectives thriving. For 20 years, I had lived in perfect comfort. For 2 decades, I filled my window boxes every spring, had my carpets cleaned, put up awnings, and covered my furniture with brown linen. Each summer, I waved farewell to my friends, and after watching them sweat in their hurried departures, I settled down to enjoy the peaceful quiet of the city, where the mail came 3 times a day, and the water supply didn't rely on a tank on the roof. And then, somehow, I lost my senses. Looking back on the months I spent at Sunnyside, it's a wonder I emerged at all. I bear the scars of those harrowing experiences. My hair has turned quite grey. Emily reminded me of that just yesterday, saying that a little bluing in the rinse water would turn my hair a lovely silver instead of a dull yellowish white. I dislike being reminded of unpleasant truths, so I snapped at her. "No," I said sharply. "I'm not using bluing at my age, nor starch for that matter." Emily claims her nerves have shattered since that dreadful summer, but she still has enough spirit left, that's for sure. When she starts getting choked up with emotion, all I have to do is threaten to return to Sunnyside, and she quickly pulls herself together, which just goes to show how unsuccessful that summer truly was. The newspaper stories have been so twisted and incomplete. One of them mentioned me only once, referring to me as just the tenant when the incident occurred, that I feel compelled to share what I know. Mr. Hartley, the detective, himself admitted he couldn't have managed without my help, even if he scarcely acknowledged it in his reports. I need to take you back 13 years to where my story begins. At that time, my brother passed away, leaving me to care for his 2 children. Michael was 11, and Claire was 7. Suddenly, all the responsibilities of motherhood fell squarely on my shoulders. Mastering the art of being a mother takes as many years as the child has lived, much like the man who started with a calf and ended up carrying the bull on his back. Nonetheless, I did the best I could. Once Claire outgrew her fondness for hair ribbons and Michael began requesting a scarf pin, along with the transition to long trousers, everything shifted. I sent them off to good schools, which meant my responsibilities were mostly about correspondence. I had 3 months each summer to update their wardrobes, review their lists of friends, and take my role as their guardian out of its long, hidden slumber. I felt the absence of summers spent together, as, in later years, they often chose to spend their vacations with friends while attending boarding school and college. Over time, I realized that my signature on a check was appreciated far more than my written letters, even though I kept in touch at regular intervals. When Michael completed his electrical studies, and Claire finished her time at boarding school, they both returned home for good, and everything changed. That winter, Claire made her social debut, turning my nights into a whirlwind of late outings to pick her up, daytime trips to the dressmaker while I tried to catch up on sleep, and a constant effort to steer her away from unsuitable suitors, whether they were wealthy but lacking in intellect or intelligent but financially challenged. I found myself picking up a lot of new terms, calling undergarments lingerie, referring to dresses as frocks and gowns, and realizing that fresh-faced sophomores were no longer boys, but rather young men in college. Michael needed less hands-on guidance, and as they both inherited their mother's fortune that winter, my role evolved into one of purely moral support. Michael bought a car, of course, and I learned to tie a grey baize veil over my bonnet. Over time, I also learned not to dwell on the dogs I had run down. People can be quite touchy about their pets. These experiences helped me become a properly equipped maiden aunt, and by spring I had grown more agreeable. So when Michael suggested camping in the Adirondacks while Claire preferred Bar Harbor, we found a middle ground with a nice country house that had golf links nearby, within driving distance of town and a phone call away from the doctor. That's how we ended up at Sunnyside. We went to check out the property, and it truly lived up to its name. The house had a welcoming look, offering no hint of anything unusual. The only oddity to me was that the housekeeper, who had been left in charge, had moved to the gardener's lodge a few days prior. Since the lodge was far enough from the house, it seemed to me that either a fire or thieves could wreak havoc without being noticed. The property was sprawling, the house perched on a hill that descended into expansive green lawns and neatly trimmed hedges leading to the road. Across the valley, maybe a couple of miles away, sat the Greenwood clubhouse. Claire and Michael were smitten. "Why, it's everything you could want," Michael declared. "A view, fresh air, good water, and great roads. And the house. It's big enough for a hospital, even if it has a Queen Anne front and a Mary Anne back," which was absurd. It was entirely Elizabethan. Naturally, we decided to take the place. It wasn't my idea of comfort, being far too large and rather isolated, making the issue of servants quite serious. But I'll give myself some credit. No matter what happened afterward, I never held it against Michael and Claire for taking me there. And one more thing. If the series of disasters taught me anything, it was that somewhere in my lineage, probably from some half-civilized ancestor who wore a sheepskin and hunted for food, I carry the instinct of the chase. If I were a man, I would be a relentless pursuer of criminals, tracking them down just as surely as my ancestor followed wild boar. But as an unmarried woman, limited by my gender, my first encounter with crime may also be my last. In fact, it nearly turned out to be my last experience with anything at all. The property belonged to Paul Cartwright, the president of the Traders' Bank, who, at the time we took the house, was out west with his wife and daughter, along with Dr. Walker, the family physician. Michael knew Louise Cartwright. He had paid her a good deal of attention the winter before, but since Michael was always charming someone, I didn't take it too seriously, even though she was a lovely girl. My only knowledge of Mr. Cartwright came from his role at the bank, where the children's money was heavily invested, and from an unpleasant rumor about his son, Arnold Cartwright, who was said to have forged his father's name on a substantial amount of bank documents. However, that story had never piqued my interest. I sent Michael and Claire off to a house party and moved to Sunnyside at the beginning of May. The roads were rough, but the trees had begun to leaf out, and there were still tulips lining the borders of the house. The arbutus filled the woods with its sweet scent beneath the dead leaves, and during the short mile from the station, as the car got stuck in the mud, I stumbled upon a bank alive with tiny forget-me-nots. The birds, all of them looked the same to me, unless they sported a flash of bright color, sang merrily in the hedges, and the air was filled with a sense of peace. Emily, raised amidst the cobblestone streets, felt a wave of melancholy wash over her as the crickets started their evening chorus, rubbing their legs together in that familiar twilight ritual. The first night drifted by quietly, and I've always appreciated that brief moment of peace. It hinted at what life in the countryside could be like under the right conditions. Never again did I rest my head on my pillow with any certainty about how long it would stay there, or even how long it would remain on my shoulders, for that matter. The next morning, Emily and Mrs. Ralston, my housekeeper, had a disagreement, leading Mrs. Ralston to leave on the 11 o'clock train. Just after lunch, Burke, the butler, was suddenly seized by a sharp pain in his right side, which only intensified when I was nearby, and by afternoon he was on his way back to the city. That night the cook sister had a baby. The cook, hesitating at first, quickly decided it was twins, and by noon the following day our household staff had dwindled down to just Emily and me, and this in a house with 22 rooms and 5 baths. Emily was eager to return to the city right away, but the milkman mentioned that Thomas Johnson, the Cartwright's colored butler, was working as a waiter at the Greenwood Club and might be able to come back. I usually hesitate to lure someone else's servant away, but when it comes to businesses or institutions, most of us have no qualms, as evidenced by the way we exploit railroads and streetcar companies when we can. So I called the club, and by 8 o'clock, Thomas Johnson came to see me. Poor Thomas. In the end, I hired him on the spot at a generous salary, allowing him to stay in the gardener's lodge, which had been vacant since the house was rented. The old man was white-haired and a bit hunched over, but he carried himself with a sense of dignity that made him speak hesitantly yet earnestly. "I'm not saying anything, Mrs. Donovan," he said, gripping the doorknob, "but there have been things going on here the last few months that just don't feel right. It's not just one thing or another, it's doors creaking and windows shutting by themselves. When doors and windows start acting up like that, and no one's around, it's time for Thomas Johnson to sleep somewhere else." Emily, who seemed to be no more than 10 feet from me that night, and terrified of her own shadow in that vast place, let out a small scream and turned a shade of sickly green. But I wasn't easily frightened. I insisted to Thomas that we were alone, and he really had to stay in the house that night. He was politely stubborn, promising to come by early the next morning. If I gave him a key, he would arrive in time for some sort of breakfast. I stood on the large porch and watched him shuffle down the dark driveway, feeling a mix of irritation at his cowardice and gratitude that he had agreed to stay at all. I admit I double-locked the hall door as soon as I stepped inside. "You can lock up the rest of the house and go to bed, Emily," I said firmly. "You're giving me the creeps just standing there. A woman your age should know better." Typically, mentioning her age snaps Emily back into her usual composure. She claims to be 40, though that's ridiculous. Her mother worked for my grandfather, so Emily has to be at least as old as I am. But that night, she wouldn't have it. "You can't be asking me to lock up, Miss Maggie," she said, her voice trembling. "There are a dozen French windows in the drawing-room and the billiard-room wing, and every one of them opens onto a porch." Mary Ann mentioned that last night she saw a man standing by the stable when she locked the kitchen door. "Mary Ann is being foolish," I replied sharply. If there had been a man there, she would have dragged him into the kitchen and fed him the leftovers from dinner within the hour, just out of habit. "Now, don't be absurd. Lock up the house and go to bed. I'm going to read." But Emily set her jaw and stood her ground. "I'm not going to bed," she insisted. "I'm going to pack, and tomorrow I'm leaving." "You'll do no such thing," I snapped. "Emily and I often feel like separating, but it never seems to happen at the same time. If you're scared, I'll go with you, but for heaven's sake, don't try to hide behind me." The house was a grand summer residence, sprawling and open. On the first floor, the architect had eliminated walls wherever possible, opting for arches and columns instead. The result was cool and spacious, but hardly inviting. As Emily and I moved from one window to another, our voices echoed back to us uncomfortably. We had plenty of light from the electric plant down in the village, but the long stretches of polished floors and mirrors reflecting us from unexpected angles began to amplify some of Emily's unease. The house was quite long, rectangular in shape, with the main entrance located in the center of one long side. The brick-paved entryway led into a short hall, to the right of which was a large living room, separated only by a row of pillars. Beyond that lay the drawing-room, and at the far end was the billiard-room. Off the billiard-room in the extreme right wing was a den, or card-room, with a small hall that opened onto the east veranda, leading up a narrow, circular staircase. Michael had pointed it out with enthusiasm. "Just look, Aunt Maggie," he said with excitement. "The architect who designed this place really knew what he was doing." Arnold Cartwright and his friends could sit here playing cards all night and stumble off to bed in the early morning without the family needing to call the police. Emily and I made it to the card room and turned on all the lights. I tried the small door leading out to the veranda and checked the windows. Everything was secure, and Emily, feeling a little less anxious now, had just pointed out the disgracefully dusty condition of the hardwood floor when, all of a sudden, the lights went out. We paused for a moment. I think Emily was too startled to scream. Then I grabbed her arm and pointed to one of the windows facing the porch. In the sudden darkness, The window stood out as a patch of greyish light, revealing a figure standing close by, peering in. Just as I noticed, it dashed across the veranda and disappeared into the night. Chapter 2. Emily's legs suddenly buckled beneath her. Silently, she sank down, leaving me frozen in shock, my gaze fixed on the window. Emily began to moan softly, and in my anxiousness, I reached down and shook her gently. "Come on, stop that," I whispered. "It's probably just a woman, maybe one of the Cartwright's maids. Get up and help me find the door." She groaned in response. "Fine then, I'll just leave you here. I'm going." That made her move, and gripping my sleeve, we cautiously felt our way, colliding with furniture more than once, until we reached the billiard room, and from there, the drawing room. As the lights flickered on, the long French windows thrown open gave me an eerie sense that faces lurked behind each one. In light of what happened later, I truly believe we were being watched the whole ghostly evening. We rushed through the rest of the closing-up routine and hurried upstairs, leaving all the lights on as our footsteps rang out like echoes in a cavern. The next morning, Emily woke up with a stiff neck from constantly glancing over her shoulder, and she refused to go to bed alone. "Please let me stay in your dressing room, Miss Maggie," she pleaded. "If not, I'll just sit in the hallway outside. I'm not going to let myself be murdered with my eyes shut." "If you're going to be murdered," I shot back, "it won't matter whether your eyes are closed or open. But you can stay in the dressing room if you promise to lie on the couch. You snore when you sleep in a chair." She was too frazzled to be offended, but after a while, she peeked through the door where I was trying to settle down with Drummond's spiritual life. "That wasn't just a woman, Miss Maggie," she insisted, holding her shoes. "It was a man in a long coat." "What woman was actually a man?" I replied, not looking up, and she returned to the couch. It was 11 o'clock by the time I finally got ready for bed. Despite my attempt to appear indifferent, I locked the door leading to the hall. When I noticed the transom wasn't secure, I cautiously set a chair in front of it. There was no need to disturb Emily. Climbing up, I placed a small dressing mirror on the ledge of the transom, knowing that any movement would send it crashing down. Feeling satisfied with my precautions, I went to bed. Sleep didn't come to me right away. Just as I was starting to doze off, Emily walked in and peeked under the bed. She hesitated to speak, perhaps because I had previously dismissed her, and eventually turned back, stopping at the doorway to let out a heavy sigh. Downstairs, a clock chimed, marking the hours, 11:30, then 45, and finally midnight. As the last chime faded, the lights went out for the night. The Casanova Electric Company closed up at midnight. I understood that if one was hosting a gathering, it was customary to tip the staff, who would stay awake a bit longer with cups of hot coffee. But on that night, the lights were gone for good. I knew Emily would fall asleep quickly, as she always did. She was unpredictable, wide awake and eager to chat when she was least wanted and drifting off when company was present. I called her name a couple of times, but all I got in response was a loud snore that hinted at her potential for choking. So I got up and lit a candle from the bedroom. My bedroom and dressing room were situated above the main living room on the first floor. On the second floor, a long corridor stretched the length of the house, with doors leading off from either side. Smaller corridors branched off the main one, creating a simple layout. Just as I settled back into bed, I heard a sound coming from the east wing that made me freeze, one bedroom slipper dangling half off my foot. It was a rattling metallic noise that echoed through the empty halls like the sound of impending doom. It sounded as if a heavy object, maybe a piece of steel, had rolled down the wooden stairs leading to the card room, making a loud, clattering noise. After the noise faded, Emily stirred and let out a snore. I was frustrated. First, she kept me awake with her silly alarms, and now when I needed her, she was sleeping like a log. I went in and woke her up, and to her credit, she was fully alert the moment I spoke. "Get up," I said, "unless you want to be murdered in your bed." "Where, how?" she shouted, springing out of bed. "There's someone in the house," I replied. "Get up. We need to get to the telephone." "Not out in the hall," she exclaimed, gripping my arm. "Oh, Miss Maggie, please, not out in the hall." But I'm a big woman, and Emily is small. Somehow we made it to the door, though Emily was struggling to lift even a brass andiron, which was all she could manage, let alone use it to defend herself. I listened closely, and hearing nothing, I opened the door just a crack and glanced into the hall. It was an inky blackness, filled with terrifying possibilities, and my candle only made the darkness more oppressive. Emily squealed, pulling me back, and as the door slammed shut, the mirror I had hung above the door fell and struck her on the head. That was the last straw for us. It took a while to convince her that a burglar hadn't attacked her from behind, and when she discovered the shattered mirror on the floor, she wasn't any more at ease. "There's going to be a death," she cried. "Oh, Miss Maggie, there's going to be a death." "There will be," I said firmly, "if you don't keep it down, Emily Allen." So we sat there until morning, fretting over whether the candle would last, until dawn, while planning which trains we could take back to town. If only we had stuck to that plan and returned before it was too late. The sun finally broke through, and from my window I watched as the trees lining the driveway took shape, shedding their ghostly look to reveal shades of grey and then green. The Greenwood Club appeared as a splash of white against the hill across the valley, and a couple of early robins hopped about in the dew. It wasn't until both the milkman and the sun arrived, almost simultaneously, that I dared to open the door into the hall and look around. Everything was just as we had left it. Trunks were scattered here and there, waiting to be taken to the trunk room, and a slice of red and yellow daylight streamed in through a stained glass window, creating a pleasantly cheerful atmosphere. The milkman was bustling about somewhere below, and the day was officially underway. Thomas Johnson strolled up the drive around 6:30, and we could hear him clattering around on the lower floor, opening the shutters. I needed to take Emily to her room upstairs, but she was convinced she would encounter something eerie. When she found nothing out of the ordinary, now emboldened by the daylight, she was actually let down. Well, we didn't return to town that day. The discovery of a small picture that had fallen from the wall of the drawing-room was enough to convince Emily that the alarm had been unfounded, but I was far from convinced. Considering my nerves and the tendency for small noises to amplify at night, there was still no way that picture could have created the series of sounds I had heard. To prove my point, I dropped it again. It fell with a soft thud as its frame broke, rendering it beyond repair. I reassured myself by thinking that if the Cartwrights chose to hang pictures precariously and rented a house that came with a family ghost, the loss was their responsibility, not mine. I cautioned Emily not to mention what had happened to anyone and called town for servants. After having a breakfast that spoke more to Thomas's warmth than his culinary skills, I set out on a brief exploration. The sounds had come from the east wing, and with some hesitation I made my way there. At first I found nothing. My skills of observation have improved since then, but back then I was inexperienced. The small card room appeared undisturbed. I searched for footprints, as is typically done in such situations, though I've found that in reality both footprints and fingerprints are more useful in stories than in life. However, the stairs in that wing gave me something to consider. At the top of the flight stood a tall wicker hamper, filled with linen that had arrived from town. It blocked the top step, nearly obstructing the way, and just below it was a long, fresh scratch. This scratch repeated itself for 3 steps, gradually fading, as if some object had fallen and hit each one. Then there was a gap of 4 steps without marks. On the 5th step down, I noticed a round dent in the hardwood. It seemed minimal, yet I was certain those marks hadn't been there the day before. They supported my theory about the sound, which had been remarkably like a metal object tumbling down the stairs. The 4 steps had been skipped over. I reasoned that something like an iron bar could create such a scenario, hitting 2 or 3 steps before coming to rest, then turning over, jumping a few stairs, and landing with a thud. Yet, iron bars don't usually tumble downstairs on their own in the middle of the night. Coupled with the figure I'd seen on the veranda, one could make an assumption about how it had gotten there. But here was the most puzzling part. All the doors had been locked that morning, the windows untouched, and the specific door leading from the card room to the veranda had a combination lock, for which I held the key, and it hadn't been tampered with. I settled on the idea of a burglary attempt as the most logical explanation, an attempt thwarted by the object that had awakened me. Two things puzzled me: how the intruder had managed to escape with everything locked up tight, and why he had left the small silver piece behind, which had remained downstairs overnight, since there was no butler. Under the guise of helping me understand the layout, Thomas Johnson guided me through the house and the cellars, but we found nothing. Everything was in excellent condition. A considerable amount of money had been spent on its construction and plumbing. The house was filled with modern conveniences, and I had no regrets about my purchase, except for the fact that night would eventually fall again, and more nights would follow, leaving us quite far from the nearest police station. In the afternoon, a carriage arrived from Casanova with a fresh set of servants. The driver, with a flourish, brought them to the servants' entrance before pulling around to the front of the house, where I was waiting. $2, he replied when I asked about the fare. I don't charge full rates since I bring them up all summer long. It works out better that way. When they got off the train, I said, "Here comes another bunch for Sunnyside, cook, parlour maid, and all." "Yes, ma'am, 6 summers, and I get a new group at least once a month. They can't handle the countryside and the loneliness, I suppose." However, with the new servants around, I felt more at ease. Later in the afternoon, I received a message from Claire letting me know that she and Michael would arrive that night around 11 o'clock, driving in from Richfield. Things were looking up, and when Beulah, my clever cat, discovered some early catnip on a bank nearby and rolled in it with pure joy, I decided it was time to reconnect with nature. While I was getting dressed for dinner, Emily knocked on the door. She still seemed a bit off, but deep down, I suspected she was more worried about the broken mirror and its ominous significance than anything else. When she came in, she was holding something in her hand, which she placed carefully on the dressing table. "I found this in the linen hamper," she said. "It must belong to Mr. Michael, but it's strange how it ended up there." It was half of a cuff button, distinctly designed, and I examined it closely. "Where exactly did you find it? Was it at the bottom of the hamper?" I asked. "It was right on top," she replied. "It's a wonder it didn't fall out on the way here." After Emily left, I studied the little piece intently. I had never seen it before, and I was sure it didn't belong to Michael. It was expertly crafted in Italy, featuring a mother-of-pearl base adorned with tiny seed pearls held together by horsehair. In the center, there was a small ruby. While the trinket was peculiar, it wasn't particularly valuable. What piqued my interest was that Emily had found it at the top of the hamper that had been blocking the stairs to the east wing. That afternoon, the Cartwrights' housekeeper, a fairly attractive young woman, came to apply for Mrs. Ralston's position, and I was pleased to take her on. With her sharp black eyes and strong jaw, she seemed to have the stamina to handle more than a dozen Emilys. Her name was Anne Watson, and for the first time in 3 days, I enjoyed dinner that evening. Chapter 3. Dinner was served in the breakfast room. For some reason, the expansive dining room felt oppressive to me, and though Thomas had been cheerful all day, his mood darkened as the sun set. He had a habit of gazing into the dim corners of the room, cast into shadow by the candlelight, which made the meal feel anything but festive. After dinner, I moved to the living room. I had 3 hours before the children would likely arrive, so I took out my knitting. I had brought along 24 pairs of slipper soles in various sizes. I always knit slippers for the old lady's home at Christmas, and now I sorted through the yarn with a firm resolve to push aside thoughts of the previous night. However, my focus was nowhere near my work. After a half hour, I realized I had added a row of blue scallops to Eliza Kleinfelter's lavender slippers, and I quickly put them away. I fetched the cuff link and made my way to the pantry. Thomas was busy polishing silver, and the air was thick with the smell of tobacco smoke. I sniffed the air and looked around, but couldn't see a pipe anywhere. "Thomas," I said, "you've been smoking." "No, ma'am," he expressed the utmost innocence. "It's on my coat, ma'am, at the club, the gentleman." But Thomas could not finish. Suddenly, the pantry was filled with the scent of burning cloth. He grabbed his coat, spun around to the sink, filled a glass with water, and quickly poured it into his right pocket with the speed of someone well practiced. "Thomas," I said as he sheepishly mopped up the mess. "Smoking is a dirty and harmful habit. If you must smoke, that's your choice. But please don't stick a lit pipe in your pocket again. Your skin is your own. You can scorch it if you wish. But this house isn't mine, and I don't want a fire here. Have you ever seen this cufflink before?" No, he claimed he hadn't, though he looked at it strangely. "I found it in the hall," I added casually. The old man's eyes were sharp beneath his bushy eyebrows. "There's something odd happening here, Mrs. Donovan," he said, shaking his head. "Something bound to occur, I assure you. You haven't noticed that the big clock in the hall has stopped, have you?" "That's ridiculous," I replied. "Clocks stop, don't they, if they aren't wound up?" "It's wound just fine, yet it stopped at 3 o'clock last night," he responded earnestly. "What's more, that clock hasn't stopped for 15 years, not since Mr. Cartwright's first wife passed away. And that's not all, no ma'am. For the last 3 nights I've spent in this house, after the power went out, I received a warning. My oil lamp was full of oil, yet it kept going out no matter what I did. The moment I shut my eyes, that lamp would extinguish. There's no clearer sign of death than that. The Bible says, 'Let your light shine.' When an unseen hand snuffs out your light, it means death for sure." The old man's voice was filled with certainty. Against my better judgment, I felt a chill run down my spine, and I left him mumbling over his dishes. Later, I heard a crash from the pantry, and Emily explained that Beulah, who is coal-black, had dashed in front of Thomas just as he was about to lift a tray of dishes. The bad omen had been too much for him, and he dropped the tray. The sound of the automobile chugging up the hill was the most welcome noise I had heard in ages, and with Claire and Michael finally arriving, my troubles seemed to lift. Claire stood smiling in the hall, her hat askew and her hair tousled beneath her pink veil. Claire was a striking young woman, no matter how her hat looked, so I wasn't surprised when Michael introduced a handsome young man who bowed to me and glanced at Trude, the silly nickname Claire had brought back from school. "Aunt Ray, I've brought a guest," Michael announced. "I want you to embrace him into your affections and include him in your Saturday to Monday plans. Meet John Morgan, but you must call him Jack. In less than 12 hours, he'll be calling you Aunt. I can assure you of that." We shook hands, and I took a moment to assess Mr. Morgan. He was tall, perhaps around 30, and sported a small mustache. I couldn't help but wonder why. His mouth seemed well-formed, and when he smiled, his teeth were above average. It's hard to understand why some men insist on a messy upper lip that surely gets in the way, just as it's perplexing to see some women elevating their hair into strange shapes. Otherwise, he was quite handsome, strong and sun-kissed, with a straightforward gaze that I appreciated. I paid particular attention to Mr. Morgan because he would play an important role in the events that followed. Claire, weary from the journey, headed to bed rather quickly. I decided to keep the details to myself until the next day and to downplay our little adventure as much as I could. After all, what was there to share? A curious face at a window, a loud crash in the night, a few scratches on the stairs, and half a cuff button. As for Thomas and his ominous feelings, I always believed that a man's character often included a dash of mischief, a splash of color, and a heavy dose of superstition. It was Saturday night. The 2 men retreated to the billiard room, and I could hear their voices as I made my way upstairs. It seemed Michael had stopped at the Greenwood Club for gasoline and found Jack Morgan there with the Sunday golf crowd. Mr. Morgan must have been easy to convince. Perhaps Claire had her reasons, and they'd brought him along triumphantly. I woke Emily to ask her to prepare something for us to eat. Thomas was too far away in the lodge to notice her clear fear of the kitchen. After that, I went to bed. The men were still in the billiard room when I finally fell asleep, and the last thing I heard was a dog howling outside, its mournful cries rising and falling with a strange hope, only to erupt again from another direction. At 3 in the morning, a gunshot jolted me awake. It sounded as if it came from right outside my door. For a moment, I lay frozen, unable to move. Then I heard Claire stirring in her room, and in an instant she flung open the door that connected us. "Oh, Aunt Ray," she shouted, her voice trembling. "Someone been killed." "It's probably thieves," I replied tersely. Thank goodness there are men in the house tonight. I slipped into my slippers and bathrobe while Claire, her hands shaking, fumbled to light a lamp. Together, we stepped into the hall where the maids, pale and frightened, were huddled at the top of the stairs, Emily leading the group. They greeted me with a chorus of whispers and questions, and I tried to calm them down. Claire had collapsed into a chair, shivering and wide-eyed. I hurried across the hall to Michael's room and knocked. When I opened the door, I found it empty. His bed hadn't been touched. "He must be in Mr. Morgan's room," I said, my heart racing as Emily followed me there. But just like Michael's room, it was also unoccupied. Claire was on her feet now, but she leaned against the door for support. "They've been killed," she gasped. Then, grabbing my arm, she pulled me toward the stairs. "They might just be hurt, and we need to find them," she insisted, her eyes wide with urgency. I can't recall how we made it down the stairs. I only remember the feeling of dread, waiting for something terrible to happen. The cook was upstairs on the phone with the Greenwood Club, and Emily stood behind me, too frightened to approach and too uneasy to stay back. We entered the living room and the drawing room, finding them untouched. I sensed that whatever we were searching for would either be in the card room or along the staircase. It was only the fear that Michael might be in danger that pushed me forward. With each step, my knees felt weaker. Claire was in front, and when we reached the card room, she halted, raising her candle high. She then pointed silently toward the doorway leading to the hall. Huddled on the floor, face down with outstretched arms, was a man. Claire dashed forward, letting out a gasping sob. "Jack!" she cried. "Oh, Jack!" Emily had screamed and run off, leaving just the two of us. It was Claire who turned him over at last, exposing his pale face, and as she drew a deep breath, she collapsed to her knees. Lying before us was the body of a man, a gentleman in a dinner jacket and white waistcoat, now stained with blood, someone I had never seen before. Chapter 4. Claire stared at the figure sprawled on the floor, captivated yet horrified. She reached out her hands, her eyes wide with shock, and I feared she would lose consciousness. "He's killed him," she whispered, her voice barely coherent. Frustration coursed through me, and I shook her gently. "What do you mean?" I asked, desperation rising in my chest. The sorrow and certainty in her voice struck deeper than any words could convey. The shake seemed to revive her, and she steadied herself, but she remained silent, fixated on the morbid sight before us. Meanwhile, Emily, embarrassed by her earlier flight and hesitant to return alone, herded 3 trembling servants into the drawing-room, the only space they were willing to enter. Once there, Claire sank to the floor, slipping in and out of fainting spells. I struggled to keep Emily from splashing her with cold water, while the maids huddled together in a corner, paralyzed by fear. Before long, though it felt like an eternity, a carriage careened up to the house, and Anne Watson, who had taken the time to dress, flung open the door. 3 men from the Greenwood Club rushed inside, clad in various outfits. I recognized Mr. Jarvis, but the other 2 were unfamiliar. "What's going on?" Mr. Jarvis inquired, surveying the chaotic scene. "Is anyone hurt?" His gaze landed on Claire. "Worse than that, Mr. Jarvis," I replied. "I believe it's murder." The word sent shockwaves through the room. The cook burst into tears, and Mrs. Watson nearly toppled over a chair in her distress. The men's expressions shifted to concern. "Not a family member, I hope?" Mr. Jarvis asked once he regained his composure. "No," I confirmed, motioning for Emily to tend to Claire. I walked ahead, carrying a lamp toward the card-room door. One of the men gasped, and they all rushed across the room. Mr. Jarvis took the lamp from me, and just then I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself. When I opened my eyes, the brief examination was over, and Mr. Jarvis was attempting to guide me into a chair. "You need to get upstairs," he insisted, "you and Miss Claire. This has been a terrible shock, especially in his own home." I stared at him, not fully grasping what he meant. "Who is it?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper as an invisible pressure tightened around my throat. "It's Arnold Cartwright," he replied, looking at me with a strange expression, "and he's been murdered in his father's house." After a moment, I pulled myself together, and Mr. Jarvis helped me into the living room. Emily had taken Claire upstairs, and the two unfamiliar men from the club remained with the body. The wave of shock and strain hit me hard. I felt weak and shaken until Mr. Jarvis's question snapped my attention back. "Where is Michael?" he asked. Michael! Claire's pale face flashed in my mind along with the empty rooms upstairs. Where was Michael? "He was here, wasn't he?" Mr. Jarvis pressed. "He went by the club on his way over." "I have no idea where he is," I replied weakly. Just then, one of the men from the club entered, asking for the telephone, and I could hear him on the line, speaking frantically about coroners and detectives. Mr. Jarvis leaned in closer to me. "Why don't you trust me, Miss Donovan?" he said. "If there's anything I can do, I will, but I need you to tell me everything." Eventually, I recounted the whole story, starting from the beginning. When I mentioned that Jack Morgan had been in the house that night, he let out a long whistle. "I wish they were both here," he said when I finished. "Whatever wild scheme took them away, it would look better if they were present, especially—" "Especially what?" I interjected. "Especially since Jack Morgan and Arnold Cartwright were known to be bitter rivals. It was Morgan who got Arnold into trouble last spring, something about the bank. And then there's also—" "Go on," I urged him. "If there's anything else I need to know, please tell me." "There's nothing more," he replied, evasive. "But there is one thing we can count on, Miss Donovan. Any court in the land would set free a man who kills an intruder in his home after dark. If Michael—" "Surely you don't think Michael did it?" I interrupted, a wave of physical nausea sweeping over me. "No, not at all," he replied, forcing a cheerful grin. "Come on, Miss Donovan, you look half dead. I'm going to help you upstairs and call your maid. This has been far too much for you." Emily assisted me back to bed, and sensing that I might freeze to death, placed a hot water bottle over my chest and another at my feet. Then she left me. It was early morning now, and from the voices I could hear just outside my window, I guessed that Mr. Jarvis and his friends were searching the grounds. Meanwhile, I lay awake in bed, my mind racing. Where had Michael gone? How did he leave, and when? Surely before the murder, but who would believe that? If either he or Jack Morgan had heard an intruder in the house and shot him as they could justly have done, why had they fled? The whole situation was bewildering, outrageous, and impossible to ignore. Around 6 o'clock, Claire entered the room. She was fully dressed, and I sat up, feeling anxious. "Oh, poor Auntie," she said softly. "What a terrible night you've had." She came over and sat by my side, and I noticed how tired and worn she looked. "Is there any news?" I asked, my heart racing. "Nothing new to report. The car is gone, but Warner, he's the chauffeur, is at the lodge, and hasn't heard anything." "Well," I replied, "if I ever come across Michael Donovan, I won't let go until I've told him a thing or two. Once this is all sorted out, I'm heading back to the city for some peace. One more night like the last two, and I'll be completely worn out. This idea of country peace is nonsense." With that, I recounted to Claire the strange noises I had heard the night before, and the shadowy figure on the veranda of the east wing. As an afterthought, I pulled out the pearl cufflink. "I'm certain now," I said, "that it was Arnold Cartwright the night before last. He must have had a key, but I can't imagine why he'd sneak into his father's house. He could have come with my permission, no problem. Anyway, whoever it was that night left behind this little memento." Claire glanced at the cufflink and turned as pale as the pearls it held. She gripped the foot of the bed and stared in shock. I was just as stunned as she was. "Where did you find it?" she finally managed to ask, struggling to maintain her composure. As I explained, she continued to gaze out the window, her expression inscrutable. It was a relief when Mrs. Watson knocked and brought me some tea and toast. She reported that the cook was in bed, completely shaken, and that Emily, buoyed by daylight, was searching for footprints around the house. Mrs. Watson herself looked a mess. Her lips were blue-white, and one of her hands was bandaged. She had fallen down the stairs in her panic. It was understandable that she would be so rattled, having been the Cartwrights, housekeeper for years and knowing Mr. Arnold well. Claire had slipped out while I was speaking with Mrs. Watson, so I got dressed and made my way downstairs. The billiard and card rooms were locked until the coroner and detectives arrived, and the men from the club had gone back to change into more appropriate clothing. I could hear Thomas in the pantry, alternating between calling for Mr. Arnold and recounting the signs that had foretold the murder. The house felt suffocating, so I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and stepped out onto the drive. At the corner near the east wing, I ran into Emily. Her skirts were damp with dew up to her knees, and her hair was still in curls. "Go right inside and change," I said firmly. "You look ridiculous, especially at your age." She held a golf club in her hand, claiming she had found it on the lawn. It looked ordinary, but it struck me that a golf club with a metal end might be the very thing that had scratched the stairs near the card room. I took it from her and sent her upstairs for dry clothes. Her bravado and self-importance, combined with her nervous excitement over the mystery, annoyed me to no end. After leaving her, I circled the building. Everything seemed undisturbed. The house looked just as tranquil and serene in the morning sun as it had on the day I was convinced to purchase it. There was no sign of the turmoil and sudden death that had occurred within. In one of the tulip beds behind the house, a blackbird was pecking intently at something shiny in the grass. I carefully made my way through the dew and bent down. Half buried in the soft ground was a revolver. I scraped the dirt off it with the tip of my shoe, then picked it up and slipped it into my pocket. It wasn't until I reached my bedroom and double-locked the door that I dared to pull it out and examine it. One glance was all it took. It was Michael's revolver. I had unpacked it the day before and placed it on his shaving stand, and there was no mistaking it. His name was engraved on a small silver plate on the handle. Panic surged through me as I realized how close danger had come to my boy, innocent as I believed him to be. I was afraid of the revolver, but found the courage to look down the barrel. It still had 2 bullets in it. I could only offer a silent prayer of gratitude that I had discovered the revolver before any keen-eyed detective arrived. I chose to stash the clues I had, the cufflink, the golf club, and the revolver, in a safe spot until I found a good reason to show them. I had placed the cufflink in a small, ornate box on my dresser. When I opened the box and reached inside, to my astonishment, it was empty. The cufflink was gone. Chapter 5. At 10 o'clock, the Casanova carriage arrived with 3 men. They identified themselves as the county coroner and 2 detectives from the city. The coroner immediately led the way to the locked wing, and with the help of one of the detectives, they examined the rooms and the body. The other detective, after a brief look at the deceased, focused his attention on the exterior of the house. Only after they had gained a solid understanding of the situation did they send for me. I welcomed them into the living room, fully prepared with my account. I explained that I had rented the house for the summer while the Cartwrights were in California. Although the staff had mentioned strange noises, I assured them that nothing had happened during the first 2 nights. However, on the 3rd night, I believed someone had entered the house. I had heard a loud crash, but didn't investigate since I was alone with 1 maid. The house had been securely locked in the morning and seemed undisturbed. Then, as clearly as I could, I described how a gunshot had awakened my niece and me the night before. We had gone to check and discovered a body. I did not recognize the murdered man until Mr. Jarvis from the club informed me who he was, and I had no idea why Mr. Arnold Cartwright would sneak into his father's house at night. I would have welcomed him there at any time. "Do you believe, Miss Donovan," the coroner asked, "that any member of your household thought Mr. Cartwright was a burglar and shot him in self-defense?" "I have no reason to think that," I replied calmly. "Your theory is that Mr. Cartwright was followed here by an enemy and shot as he entered the house." "I wouldn't say I have a theory," I answered. "What puzzles me is why Mr. Cartwright entered his father's house on 2 consecutive nights, slipping in like a thief, when all he had to do was ask for entry." The coroner was a quiet man. After taking some notes, he seemed eager to catch the next train back to town. He scheduled the inquest for the following Saturday, gave Mr. Hartley, the younger and sharper-looking of the 2 detectives, a few instructions, and after offering me a solemn handshake and expressing his regrets about the unfortunate situation, he left with the other detective. Just as I began to relax, Mr. Hartley, who had been standing by the window, approached me. "The family consists of just you, Miss Donovan." "My niece is here," I replied. "And there's no one else besides you and your niece." "My nephew." I had to wet my lips before speaking. "Oh, a nephew. I'd like to meet him if he's around." "He's not here at the moment," I said as calmly as I could. "I expect him back soon." "He was here last night, I believe." "Yes, no, I mean. Did he bring a guest with him, another man?" "He had a friend over for the weekend, Mr. Morgan." "Mr. John Morgan, the cashier at the Traders' Bank, if I'm right." I realized someone at the Greenwood Club had informed him. "When did they leave?" "Very early. I don't know exactly what time." Mr. Hartley suddenly turned to look at me. "Please try to be clear," he said. "You mentioned your nephew and Mr. Morgan were in the house last night, yet you and your niece, along with some servants, found the body. Where was your nephew?" I was completely frantic by that point. "I don't know," I exclaimed, "but I assure you this. Michael knows nothing about this, and no amount of circumstantial evidence can make an innocent man guilty." "Sit down," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "There are some things I need to explain, and in return, please share everything you know. Trust me, the truth always comes to light." Mr. Cartwright was shot from above. The bullet was fired at close range, entering below his shoulder and exiting further down his back after passing through his heart. This suggests the murderer was standing on the stairs when he fired. Additionally, I found a charred cigar on the edge of the billiard table, burned halfway down, along with a cigarette that had been smoked to the cork tip. Both had clearly been lit, then set down and forgotten. "Do you have any idea why your nephew and Mr. Morgan left their cigars, and their game to take the automobile without calling for the chauffeur? All of this happening well before 3 o'clock in the morning." "I don't know," I replied. "But trust me, Mr. Hartley, Michael will return to explain everything." "I truly hope so," he said. "Miss Donovan, have you considered that Mr. Morgan might know something about this?" Just then Claire came downstairs, and as he spoke, she walked in, stopping suddenly as if she had been hit. "He doesn't," she said, her voice sounding strange. "Mr. Morgan and my brother know nothing about this. The murder happened at 3. They left the house a quarter before 3. "How do you know that?" Mr. Hartley asked, clearly puzzled. "Do you really know what time they left?" "I do," Claire replied firmly. "My brother and Mr. Morgan left the house at a quarter before 3 by the main entrance. I was there." "Claire," I said, feeling a surge of disbelief, "you're mistaken. At a quarter to 3. "Listen," she insisted. "At 2:30, the telephone downstairs rang. I hadn't fallen asleep yet, so I heard it. Then I heard Michael answer, and a few minutes later he came upstairs and knocked on my door. We talked for a moment, then I put on my robe and slippers and went downstairs with him. Mr. Morgan was in the billiard room. We talked together for about 10 minutes before it was decided that they should both leave." "Can you be a bit clearer?" Mr. Hartley asked. "Why did they go away?" "I'm just recounting what happened, not explaining why it happened," she replied calmly. "Michael went to get the car, but instead of bringing it to the house and waking everyone up, he took the lower road from the stable. Mr. Morgan was supposed to meet him at the foot of the lawn. Mr. Morgan left." "Which way?" Mr. Hartley interrupted, his voice sharp. "By the main entrance. He left at a quarter to 3. I'm certain of it." "The clock in the hall is stopped. Miss Donovan," Hartley noted, his keen attention capturing everything. "He checked his watch," she answered, and I saw Mr. Hartley's expression change, as if he suddenly understood something important. Throughout her account, I had been drowning in disbelief. "May I ask you a personal question?" The detective, a relatively young man, seemed slightly embarrassed. "What is your relationship with Mr. Morgan?" Claire hesitated for a moment before she walked over and placed her hand gently in mine. "I'm engaged to marry him," she stated simply. I was so used to surprises by now that I could only gasp, while Claire's hand felt feverishly warm in mine. "And what happened next, Mr. Hartley continued. "So you went straight to bed?" Claire paused, her expression thoughtful. "No," she finally replied. "I'm not nervous, and after I'd turned off the light, I remembered something I had left in the billiard room, so I made my way back there in the dark." "Can you tell me what it was you forgot?" "I can't say," she said slowly. "I didn't leave the billiard room right away." "Why not?" The detective's voice was firm. "This is crucial, Miss Donovan." "I was crying," Claire admitted quietly. "When the French clock in the drawing-room struck 3, I got up, and that's when I heard a step on the east porch just outside the card-room. Someone was fiddling with the latch, and I figured it was Michael. When we moved in, he called that his entrance, and he had a key for it all along. The door opened, and I was about to ask what he had forgotten when there was a flash and a bang. Something heavy fell, and, completely terrified and in shock, I ran through the drawing-room and somehow made it upstairs. I barely remember how." She sank into a chair, and I thought Mr. Hartley had finished, but he was just getting started. "You certainly exonerate your brother and Mr. Morgan quite effectively," he remarked. "Your testimony is invaluable, especially since I understand that your brother and Mr. Cartwright had a serious quarrel some time ago." "That's nonsense," I interjected. "Things are bad enough without creating conflict where there isn't any. Claire, I don't believe Michael even knew the murdered man, did he?" But Mr. Hartley was confident. "The quarrel, if I'm not mistaken," he pressed on, "was about Mr. Cartwright's behavior towards you, Miss Claire. He had been making unwanted advances. And I hadn't even seen the man. When she nodded her agreement, I recognized the significant implications. If this detective could establish that Claire had feared and disliked the murdered man, and that Mr. Cartwright had been bothersome, possibly even pursuing her with his unwanted attention, and combined with Claire's admission that she had been in the billiard room at the time of the crime, it all seemed rather suspicious. Given the family's influence, we could expect a determined effort to find the murderer, and if nothing worse awaited us, we were certainly in for some unpleasant publicity. Mr. Hartley snapped his notebook shut and thanked us. "I have a feeling," he said, out of the blue, "that at least we can put the ghost rumors to rest here. Whatever those noises were, as the colored gentleman claims they started when the family went west 3 months ago, they'll likely stop now." That showed just how little he understood. The ghost wasn't laid to rest at all. With Arnold Cartwright's murder, it somehow felt more alive than ever. After Mr. Hartley departed, and once Claire went upstairs, something she did right away, I sat down and reflected on what I had just heard. Her engagement, which had once seemed so important, now felt trivial compared to the weight of her story. If Michael and Jack Morgan had left before the crime, then how did Michael's revolver end up in the tulip bed? What could explain their abrupt departure? What had Claire left behind in the billiard room? What was the significance of the cufflink, and where could it be?